Hello everyone, and welcome to the first video in our series exploring some of the more nuanced and complex aspects of resilience. My name is Siobhán McBean. I'm a partner in the Asset Management and Investment Funds group here at Arthur Cox. To start off, I'm joined by my colleague Ciaran Flynn, who heads up our Governance and Consulting Services group. So Ciaran, plenty has happened since our last webinar in the area of resilience. Could you provide us with a quick update?
Absolutely, Siobhán. Thank you for having me here. So since we spoke in June, the Central Bank have somewhat unexpectedly published a revised version of the cross-industry guidance on operational resilience to incorporate changes which, I suppose in their own words, have been informed by recent developments and valuable ongoing industry engagement, but fundamentally is about bringing alignment and consistency with what DORA has brought to bear on the industry. Now, we've gone through this and compared and contrasted the new version with the previously existing version of the cross-industry guidance. And I suppose there are three main things we want to bring to people's attention. I suppose the first one of those is that the CBI expects firms now to document both an operational resilience framework and an operational risk framework separately. And while they do very much flag that these two documents should be aligned and hang together, they do very much expect them to be separate and distinct, which is an evolution on the previous view where a combined version would have been acceptable. I suppose secondly, they've re-emphasized the very different perspectives taken in documenting an organization's approach to operational resilience versus how firms are approaching the implementation of DORA. And what we mean by that is that CBI defines a business service as being external facing and having an identifiable external end user from an operational resilience perspective. But from a digital resilience perspective under DORA, firms are asked to focus on all services which support the delivery of critical business functions, whether they be internal or external facing. So there is that kind of fracturing of view. And I think finally, the CBI have revised their guidance in encouraging all regulated entities to consider adopting the requirements of DORA in a manner proportionate to their operations, regardless of whether they are in scope or not. Simply put, the CBI views DORA as a best practice when it comes to ICT risk management and digital resilience, and will expect all firms to bear this in mind when they're addressing those risks for their organisation.
What it sounds like is that the central bank is really trying to get firms to think about how they approach the various components of their wider resilience framework and take the necessary steps to try to ensure that their documentation is consistent and coherent across the piece.
So when approaching a holistic concept of resilience, there are really 5 core pillars that we suggest clients look at. Firstly, there's operational risk and business continuity. Secondly, there is operational resilience itself. Thirdly is digital resilience, ICT risk management frameworks. Fourthly is financial resilience. And then finally, third-party risk management. We're going to focus on the first 3 of these pillars today, but for anybody who wants to find out more across all of the 5 pillars, we've included the details in our resilience playbook, which can be found on our website. So to start off with, we have to look at operational risk and business continuity lens, which typically outlines in an organization's authorization legislation. Any risk practitioners listening will know operational risk is an all-encompassing term, but typically covers the impact or consequences to the firm where a process or a system has not performed the way it was intended, whether that be through a manual error or a systems failure. So when applying this lens, firms are asked to think about a single point of failure and assume that everything else is operating as normal. So if you take a traditional business continuity plan, for example, that plan will cover what happens when a single system goes down or a key individual can't perform their role for a given reason. So it's important to note here that third-party risks or risks arising from outsourcing or delegation are considered key subcomponents of operational risk. So secondly then, we have the operational resilience lens. This is where the Central Bank of Ireland's updated cross-industry guidance focus on. This lens looks solely at those external facing critical or important business services which are provided to identifiable end users, such as an organization's clients or investors. In contrast, this lens doesn't assume a single point of failure, but instead looks at end-to-end delivery of the services, but only if that failure could cause intolerable harm outside the organization itself. You can see where the complexity is coming from. The final lens we have to focus on today is digital resilience. And so the ICT risk management framework prescribed by DORA. Again, this end looks like that end-to-end delivery of critical or important business functions. But this time we're looking about internal and external functions. The limitation this time, however, is that DORA is only concerned with the resilience of ICT systems and applications which support critical or important functions, or ICT third-party providers who support those critical or important functions. So multiple lenses, but each is very distinct and at times narrow, and can add to that compliance challenge for firms.
And I suppose the key area of resilience that is not addressed by the current regulations or legislation is the end-to-end delivery of non-ICT dependent internal facing services. So some of the best examples of these overlooked services are, ironically, the oversight and governance activities that organisations must perform in-house, including, for example, compliance, risk management, oversight of service providers. And these activities are a core part of the functions that are typically performed in Ireland by Irish regulated firms. And yet, as those services are not part of the external facing licensed activities that the organisation is authorised to provide, they won't typically make the cut to be considered a critical or important business function under the operational resilience guidelines. And they are unlikely to be ICT dependent to the extent that they would be captured as a critical or important business function under DORA. So what firms need to recognise then is that while the core legislation and regulation in this area may exclude many of the services which are performed in-house, it is still vitally important that these services are considered and planned for as part of a firm's resilience framework. So, Ciaran, if we take that step back then and consider what else should firms be thinking about when reviewing their broader resilience framework, how can they make sure that they're taking a holistic view, and what does that look like?
Thanks, Siobhán. So it's important to note here that firms who've already taken those necessary steps to comply with the various different regulations and guidance we've spoken about today, that they have the vast majority of the necessary work done and documented. What could be missing from these documents are the plans around the non-ICT dependent internal facing services that you mentioned. We can think for an example perhaps of a system outage at a service provider which impacts the delivery of a core business line in the firm. Firstly, we know that the service provider should trigger the relevant business continuity plans and to implement any potential workarounds or backup systems and to resolve the root cause of the issue and restore normal functionality as quickly as possible. But secondly, we also need to realise that the relationship manager within the firm should be communicating with that same service provider and overseeing how the incident has been handled in line with the firm's third-party management framework or outsourcing framework or whatever they've called that piece of documentation. Within that, are both these activities, the performance of the service and the oversight of the service, being treated the same way? Based on my experience in the industry and from working with our clients, I think it's safe that most firms would say probably not. And we need to pause and ask ourselves, why is that? So the core business line which has been disrupted is most likely to going to have categorised as a critical or important business service or function, and hence will have a relatively tight recovery time objective before intolerable harm is caused, so potentially anything between 4 and 24 hours. And they've been assessed as a high business impact, whether that's been driven by cost, potential for losses, legal or reg implications, and so on. So if you turn to the third-party oversight work stream for a moment, then we can say the same for it being as time critical. So while the performance of the core business line is captured by the firm's resilience framework, that governance and oversight piece, even in a crisis situation, typically is not. I would encourage firms to consider their governance and oversight activities, how they would be performed should the network go down and they lose access to things like email and video calls.
I think that's a great point. So for a firm to be truly resilient, they need to identify all the functions, services and activities they perform, regardless of whether they are ICT dependent or not, or internal versus external facing. And they need to make sure they have plans in place should something happen. So, for example, we're seeing a lot more clients now building resilience requirements into, say, their senior leadership role descriptions, appointment letters, management responsibility maps. And it's true, resilience can't or can no longer be considered in a silo, and instead it needs to be integrated into how boards manage and govern their organisations more broadly. So in our next video in this resilience series, we will provide some further practical guidance and advice on where to start when trying to identify your business services and functions, and the importance of mapping critical interdependencies and connectivities. To accompany this video series, we have created a concise resilience playbook, which will summarise what we've covered and also share some additional practical tips and insights which will help you on your resilience journey. As ever, please feel free to get in touch with your usual Arthur Cox contact, or you can send us an email at resilience@arthurcox.com on any issues or topics we've covered today. And for more, you can also visit our website, arthurcox.com/resilience.